So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Menaka Gopinath, President of Ipsos's Social Listening Practice. Menaka, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So today we're going to be talking about breaking down the so-called pandemic wall. As Ellen mentioned, we'll be looking at information that's coming from both the social conversation landscape as well as our online syndicated community. My name is Menaka Gopinath. As Ellen said, I lead our online communities and social intelligence practice. I'm happy to be joined today with my co-presenter, Christy Moorman. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Christy Moorman. I'm a Senior Vice President on Menaka's community team, or as a part of the community practice. Look forward to our discussion today.
Thanks, Christy. So we're going to turn our videos off for now, but we will turn them back on at the end if there's any questions. As Ellen mentioned, you're welcome to submit those throughout the presentation. All right. So today we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to start with the impact of COVID. And I know this has been a big topic of conversation because we surpassed our year mark in March. But we'll look at kind of how it started and how it's going. We'll then jump into kind of the effect of this pandemic wall and in essence, the COVID fatigue that we're all experiencing and the opportunities that we're seeing in terms of breaking down that wall. We'll dive into financially, physically, and mentally, and socially. And then we'll finish up by looking at the pandemic rebound and how we're seeing brands kind of come into play in the context of these different lenses that we'll be honing in on more today. And like I said, we'll end with the Q&A, so please submit your questions so we can get to those at the end. All right, so just to kick us off, for over a year at Ipsos, we've been tracking the impact of COVID-19, the emotional journey, and the dynamic phases in a continuum we've been calling the IPAC, the Ipsos Pandemic Adaptability Continuum. So essentially what it is just looking at different phases that people have been going through. This is a very individual experience. Everyone really has been going through this, this pandemic in their own ways, and it's definitely not linear. So while you see the different phases in a linear format on this slide, we've definitely seen that people have been going back and forth from uncertainty to acclimation to recalibration, back to preparation. And it's really dependent on kind of where we're at and the individual experiences people are having. So when we look at the view of the IPAC in the context of the past close to a year, this is looking at May of last year through March of this year. We can see that there is kind of this starting to see light at the end of the tunnel. We're seeing anticipation on the rise. So if you can see kind of this big orange block here is really acclimation. That's been the dominant phase throughout this pandemic, felt by many. But as you can see at the end here, the purple, the blue, these are really anticipation, recalibration starting to build. If we zoom in on that view, so what you're seeing here is kind of since the vaccine came out, which was in like November of last year, we are definitely seeing the increase in those later phases corresponding to the increase in vaccination rates. So at the time of this chart, it was, I think we were close to 15%. Now that's even higher. So definitely seeing kind of the impact of more and more people being vaccinated, having an impact on how people are feeling and what that looks like in their IPAC phase. But of course, the impact of COVID continues. Just some recent data points from Ipsos, you can see 44% still see COVID-19 as the most worrying issue in the US, compared to 29% for unemployment. 51% see it as high or very high threat to our country. And 80% can definitely relate to this one, have some level of uncertainty when it comes to planning for the future after the pandemic. I think no matter what, there's just a lot of unknown in the context of what even the future looks like. You can see on the right here, this is actually was submitted by one of our community members where we asked them to kind of share how it started for them and how it's going. I think it reiterates what we just mentioned. You know, this person was very afraid, worried, and unsure at the beginning, and now bored, frustrated, annoyed. It feels like this pandemic is never ending. So in that context, we've really seen that fatigue has been a constant throughout this pandemic. So what you're seeing on the chart here is we've been trending emotions week over week and then month over month later on over the course of the last year. We really just asked our community members a question. We said, how do you feel this week? And just unaided, give us 3 words that describe how you're feeling. And you can see here, like, fear definitely was the beginning, kind of like the community member on the previous slide. That was really where everyone was at. There's a lot of fear. We didn't know what this really meant. And that really seemed to subside. It spiked a bit in the winter months around the election, as well as an uptick in cases. But that's really been on the decline. And there's been a variation of other emotions coming through, but you can see that, optimism is definitely growing, but at the top of this chart is fatigue. And that has really been the dominant. And there's been many articles in recent weeks and months about the impact of this consistent fatigue that we've been feeling. What is the impact of that? What is the impact of sustained kind of micro trauma over the course of the past year? And how does that look as we look forward in terms of reemergence? This kind of fatigue and stress and anxiety is definitely reiterated in the social conversation. So what you're seeing in this topic wheel is looking at the social conversation, not necessarily linked to COVID specifically, but just lifestyle conversation in general. And you can see the emotions here. While optimism is growing since November, and anger has declined, partially due to the election being over. A lot of anger in social conversation was linked to the election. You do see that anxiety, stress, worry is a big chunk of this wheel still. So it's definitely dominating, and I know we can all relate to the GIF on the right here as well. And this is just reiterating that in some verbatim. I think as you can see with this verbatim in the middle here, my entire body has been overtaken by anxiety. I am a nervous wreck, basically 24/7. While that might not be the case for everyone, I think we can all kind of relate and empathize with the fact that all of us are feeling a lot of stress and the fatigue as a result. In fact, stress and anxiety, this is just another lens. I'm just going to reiterate how stressed and anxious we all are. But this is looking at it in the context of social conversation with a different view, kind of looking at it compared to other topics. So it's really been a constant driver of conversation. It's the thick purple line that you see on this chart. But if you look at it compared to other topics that early on in the pandemic were pretty big drivers of conversation, like talking about social distancing, talking about businesses reopening, talking about unemployment, cooking, which was a big topic of conversation early on. A lot of those have really declined in conversation over the past year, and where we see kind of the consistent line here is in that stress and anxiety conversation. I don't know if you've seen this on the left here. I miss how things used to be. Normal life? No, like banana bread quarantine when everyone clapped for healthcare workers instead of going to Cabo. So it's definitely kind of this consistent stress and anxiety. There's the fun of making banana bread and sourdough has subsided, and that impact of the stress continues. And I did want to just quickly dig into that as it relates to the lens of women, because for women in particular, it absolutely has had an impact on kind of how they've had to take on many different roles. We're seeing that play out in the context of the quote unquote she-cession, with many women having to leave the workforce in order to manage their families and take on all of these other roles that they have to take care of. And you can see, there's a lot on this chart here on the right. This is a mental network here. But you can see when we asked our community members, what do you think has been the biggest impact of COVID-19 on the lives of women? It's really kind of such a variety of things that are taking over. Juggling too much, more responsibilities, remote learning, children in general, financial stress, no breaks, lack of self-care, staying healthy. I think a lot of us can definitely relate to what we're seeing here. And as this verbatim on the left shows from one of our members, Many of us are trying to juggle multiple balls in the air at once, working at a full or part-time job, while also trying to be a teacher and all of the things that we have to be. And that obviously has had a huge impact on all of us. So with all of this stress, lots of stress, people are obviously very eager to return to quote unquote normal, though many of us don't know necessarily what that means. And we can see that kind of in the COVID focused conversations in social. So what you're seeing here is really looking at the conversations that specifically mention elements of COVID, like COVID, coronavirus, et cetera. And we're looking at the change in subtopics in that conversation. So early on in May 2020, a big part of the conversation was dominated by deaths, and then a lot of the implications of staying at home and the shelter-in-place orders. So what is it going to mean, like working from home? How am I going to get food delivered? When our business is going to reopen? That was a big part of the conversation. Now, not surprisingly, it's very much about the vaccine and implications of the vaccine on the economy. Is that going to help with trade? Is there going to be an impact on the general economy, and new ways of working, like the gig and service workers has been a big piece of that too. So I think people are really looking at what are the implications of this vaccine and how is that going to help us in this reemergence. But despite the hope of the vaccine, I think this quote unquote, like I said, return to normalcy is still not necessarily in the next couple of months. I think there's some of us that are feeling like it's, not too far off, but the majority see it as, over 6 months to a year, until what that, potential normalcy really means. But even 15 or close to 15% say, I have no idea. And I think this verbatim kind of brings that to life. And it's a big if, enough people reach herd immunity, I envision socializing going back to normal over time, probably in a year or more. So we don't really know what's going to happen. So with all of that, clearly there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of fatigue, and there's a lot of unknown. And that is really what kind of we're talking about when we talk about this pandemic wall. But how are we going to break it down? How are we going to prepare for reemergence, and what are the opportunities that we see there? So more than a year in, COVID clearly has taken its toll. Not sure if you enjoyed many of the memes that came out last month looking at March 2020 versus March 2021. Some really good ones out there. But I think it reiterates also kind of where COVID has definitely taken its toll financially, physically, mentally, socially, right? There's a lot of things. So we're going to look at each of these areas and dig into more of kind of what are those impacts, but more importantly, what are the opportunities that we're seeing in these areas? So just to kind of bring to life this idea of the pandemic wall, what does it mean? It really is kind of what I just went through. It's all of the impacts of the things that are kind of compounding on one another. I think the New York Times actually just put out an article last week, said we've all hit a wall. So I think it's kind of looking at how are we kind of dealing with that wall and what does it look like to move past it? So the first piece is financial. I mean, obviously financial stress is taking its toll. From a recent study we did in our community, we found that 1 in 5 Americans are worrying about having enough money to even pay their rent or mortgage. As you can see in this verbatim, I'm so tired of being unemployed and depressed. It's stupid. I just want a job. This is definitely taking a toll and a big piece of why we're hitting that wall. In the social conversation, you kind of see this reiterated. If we look at the health and wellness conversation in general, over 1 million of the mentions include some level of finances, and close to half of them are about stress and anxiety. You can see that in the hashtags over here around depression, anxiety, recession, pandemic. It's just, there's a lot that's impacting our mental health as it relates to finances. And that's also reiterated in our community data. So we see here, when we ask people about their personal finances and how they're feeling, a good amount actually do feel calm, some sense of calm, because they've been able to save money, because they feel like they have a bridge to keep them going. But for a lot, and close to 40%, money is still causing a lot of concern, anxiety, overwhelmed, tired, scared, and angry. And I think that data point really just reiterates the divide that we're seeing and the financial inequity our country faces, with many people still living paycheck to paycheck or unemployed. So obviously the stimulus check has some impact on that, but from a recent Ipsos study we did, we saw that 57% see income equality as the most serious issue to equality in general in America. And that's really reiterated in the experiences that many of the people that we've heard from are talking about. It's been a year and the money situation isn't getting any better. I owe everybody. There's no end to bills in sight, yet my savings are disappearing. This is having an impact on people. But when we look at kind of the optimism or the potential hope in the context of this struggle, I think the economic uncertainty so many of us have experienced this year has really jolted many to take a more active role in their financial futures. One way that we've seen that come through in the social conversation more recently is the huge increase in conversation around cryptocurrency. So 334% increase in conversation about crypto. If we look at the past quarter in 2021 versus the same period of time last year. You can see that in this thing, just how like crypto, huge spike in the conversation. And a big part of that cryptocurrency conversation is around empowerment. I need to take charge of my own economic future. I need to have a role in what my financial wellness looks like. So now I'm going to pass it over to Christy, who's going to talk about some of the other lenses we mentioned. Christy?
Thanks, Menaka. So now for this next section, want to focus on how this stress is affecting people's health and wellness. And I think the quote here on this slide kind of sums up a lot of what we are seeing, which is this evolving definition of health to include both physical and mental health, especially as people are looking for ways to combat stress. So in this, in the same breath, they're talking about things like exercising and eating well, but also meditating and being in the now and being mindful. So really this convergence and elevating of the importance of mental health. And this is really directly related to the amount of stress that people are under right now. This chart is showing the health and wellness conversation online and some of the key themes that we've seen in that conversation since the beginning of the pandemic. And you can see that stress and anxiety is really a huge part of this discussion. It's the purple line here at the top. And what this is showing is that stress and anxiety in the context of health and wellness is really accounting for more than half of the conversation overall. And we're learning, as Menaka mentioned, that this chronic level of stress is leading to a lot of fatigue and burnout. And there's this collective trauma, that everyone is going through. And people are really doing a variety of activities to help relax or help them feel rejuvenated. So some of the other things that you'll see on this slide are, cooking, showing up in the conversation and at-home recipes. Some people are dealing with this by exercising. Some are eating indulgent foods or, drinking too much alcohol potentially. And there are a lot of different ways that people are dealing with this stress, and some of those are really healthier, than others. And this is also kind of showing up in the supplements or herbal remedies that people are using. And we're seeing an increase in use of supplements specifically to support sleep and relaxation. So you can see the chart on the left here. This is coming from our community. 11% reported that they are using sleep supplements more now than they were before COVID. And 6 to 7% say that they are using more cannabis or CBD as well. And people really see these supplements or herbal remedies as a form of self-care, and they're using it to help support their mental and emotional health. And you can see in some of the quotes on the right, we also asked our community members about how they plan to take care of themselves. And many people spoke about the importance of vitamins or supplements or getting enough sleep, and then even CBD and cannabis as a part of that. And so, this is really new for us. In past research, we haven't really seen people talk about these behaviors in the context of health and supporting their mental health. And, mental health continues to be a struggle for many of us. And, even with the increasing vaccination rates, and obviously there's a lot of hope on the horizon, we continue to see our community members struggle with mental health. So the chart on the right is from our community. And when we asked the question, 37% of the community members rated their mental health as fair or poor. And even though 60% feel positive about their mental health, they're doing a lot of work to get there. And some of the quotes on the right on the left, really bring that to life. They're doing things like going to therapy or meditating, making sure that they're getting enough sleep, that they're exercising. So it's really taking a lot of action on their part to stay in that positive space, and it's not easy. The pandemic has also evolved the way people think about health and wellness in general, which is kind of how I started off this section. Formerly when we talked to people about health and wellness, it was very much defined by physical health. So they would talk about exercise or what they're eating, are they eating well? But this definition really has evolved to include mental well-being as well. And consumers are actively buying products and services to support their health, and doing so at a really high rate. So you can see here nearly 80% in a recent poll that Ipsos did reported buying products or services to support their health and well-being. And this really demonstrates that people want to take more control over their health, and they're looking for solutions, brands, companies to help them in that quest. And this emergence of other forms of self-care is also reiterated in the broader social conversation as well. So exercise is still the primary activity that people are talking about in the context of health and wellness, but we are also seeing things like yoga and meditation and prayer showing up in this context. And on the next slide, we also talk to our community members about the ways that they are looking to support their health and wellness right now, and looking at this from multiple angles. So we ask them to think about physical health as well as mental and emotional health. This slide is just taking that unaided conversation and using text analytics to quantify some of those themes and pull out some of the themes. And so you can see the topics that are emerging here. And in the middle, those are the activities that are seen as supporting both physical and mental or emotional health. So there are many activities that kind of overlap between the two, things like exercising or getting outdoors and staying active. So those are seen as being having a positive impact on physical and mental health. But what was interesting is the prevalence of activities related to mindfulness. So you can see some of the ones in orange on the top right here. Things like meditation or yoga. We also saw journaling show up, or therapy. And these were showing up as pretty prevalent in the conversation. And these mindfulness activities seem to be becoming more and more mainstream as people are looking to be more proactive in how they are maintaining their mental health, their positive mental health. So now moving on to the social aspect of this and the stress that people are experiencing there. One of our community members recently told us, you see the quote here, "It is no way to live to never get out." And I think we would all agree with that statement. But let's talk about some of the effects that we're seeing of forcing people to stay in. So it's not surprising that a lack of social interaction during the pandemic has led to feelings of loneliness. But based on our most recent polling, 31% have said that they feel lonely, and 46% have grown even more lonely over the past 6 months. And this is really especially true for people who are living alone or who are single and don't necessarily have, immediate family members living with them. So of course, people are feeling lonely. And at the same time, people are also a bit cautious or even fearful about reemerging after quarantine. And this is really creating a tension that we'll kind of dig into over the next several slides. So we asked people in our community what they think the biggest challenges would be for them personally in returning to normal. And the chart on the right is showing the unaided responses that we received to that question. And we used text analytics again to kind of quantify what we were seeing there. But the most commonly mentioned topics here all fall under this broad umbrella of fear of others. So things like be afraid of being around people or crowds, socializing, trusting people, going out. So this idea of, getting back to quote unquote normal, or the way things used to be from a socializing perspective, will definitely pose challenges, and people will continue to need reassurance that going out is going to be safe for them. One example of this fear is the way people talk about dating in the time of COVID. So there's this mix of emotions. Some people are relieved to be single or not dating during this time, but others also talk about a fear of dating. And dating apps have innovated as a result of that to include features that would indicate if a person has been vaccinated or if they've previously had COVID. And this is how dating apps are dealing with the fear that people are feeling and trying to do what they can to help people feel safe. So that's just one example of how companies are helping. We also talked to our community members about the ways they plan to create joy for themselves this spring. And we see a lot of anticipation of spending time outdoors. And, I think for a lot of us, me included, this past winter was really difficult. It was harder to be socially distant with friends when you have to be inside. And so it really limited opportunities to be out with others. And so with the warmer weather, people are really looking forward to getting outside, and that's really how they plan to create joy for themselves. And so you see that, people want to do things like grilling out or gardening or going somewhere local, social distancing with neighbors. But what's interesting is all of those things are pretty close to home. They're not necessarily venturing out into crowded places like going to concerts or like flying on a plane, as an example. So it definitely reiterates again that there's this hesitation to really going back out in a big way. And all that said, though, there definitely is hope. In our community, we've been regularly tracking, at least monthly, where people feel comfortable going out. And just in the last few weeks, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase as vaccinations are ramping up in terms of where people feel comfortable going out. So more and more, especially if you look at the items at the top of this chart, people are feeling comfortable with everyday activities like going to restaurants or shopping or going to the salon. And the first quote on the right, I think, really supports this increasing level of comfort that's coming along with vaccination. So this person said, as more people get vaccinated, my comfort level will increase. So definitely some hope on the horizon as vaccinations ramp up. And then we're seeing a lot of this optimism with people who have already been vaccinated or are planning to or have immediate plans to. So they're starting to dream about travel and about hugging their loved ones. These examples here are all from social conversations of people talking about hugging their grandparents or grandparents hugging their children. So again, just lots of optimism on the horizon. We've also been mining social data to look at how people are talking about what they're most looking forward to. And it's interesting to see league sports really showing up as the dominant topic in that conversation. And this data here is going back to January, even before opening day or March Madness. And in fact, just today, we're seeing that the hashtag baseball is back is trending. So people just love their sports and are really looking forward to attending a game in person in the near future. And it's also not surprising that we see travel showing up in the conversation of what people are looking forward to. So 31% of the folks are talking about travel. I know for me personally, I'm very much looking forward to traveling again. And beyond just, dreaming about being able to travel or attend an event, people are actually making more tangible plans now. So we recently asked our community members if they were planning to make any summer vacation plans. And 41% said they are already have made plans or are in the process of making travel plans. And 58% mentioned that they're likely to take an overnight trip this year. 33% of Major League Baseball fans plan to attend an in-person game this year. So lots of anticipation and even planning of being able to do these types of activities again this year as vaccination rates increase. But, people do expect safety to be an element of those experiences, and they expect for safety precautions to remain. Many expect, when we ask people in our community about travel, many say they expect social distancing and masks are going to be required, and they really expect or want these reassurances in order to feel safe. And that really leads us to the last item on our agenda today, which was to talk about how companies and brands can help people manage some of these challenges. So I'll pass it back now to Menaka.
Thank you, Christy. Yeah, so we're going to just finalize today's conversation by talking about kind of how this signals opportunities for brands and how brands are actually already kind of helping in the context of this reemergence and breaking down those walls. So I think that's the big thing here, is that you probably saw this thematically in what Christy just shared, is that there's a lot of just greater awareness and people realizing that, doing your best does not mean pushing yourself to the point of a mental breakdown. We're seeing kind of the mental health importance entering the mainstream. And that's something that I think is really key to how people are working to break down this pandemic wall. And as we also saw in a lot of the data points we shared, the hope is rising. We're seeing greater optimism come through in the social conversation, for example. And we're also seeing that in our Ipsos data as well, with more people feeling hopeful versus over the past year. The verbatim on the right is from Social Conversation. A little over a year ago, the pandemic suddenly upended our lives. Today, I'm filled with optimism and hope. Brighter days are ahead. So definitely seeing that kind of come through. And I think the other piece is that our priorities have come into sharper focus, right? That's something that I think we tried to share in the previous section, is that people are realizing the importance of these pieces of their lives. Financially, we've seen from social as well as from our community that there's just this realization like, wow, I really need to have savings. I need to make sure that I budget better. And I need to be more empowered, like I mentioned before. Socially, you saw, like Christy shared, like how we're seeing all these people talking about just hugging. Like, I miss hugging. That's such a big piece of the social connection that we need. And also just kind of who we are engaging with. Like, I want to see my family, and having more prioritization there. Mentally, a lot of the things that Christy already mentioned, just really wanting to prioritize that mental health piece, and that has that direct link to the physically as well, like making sure that I'm eating right and exercising. These are all themes that we continue to see in terms of kind of how the impact of this pandemic has helped us kind of see where we need to prioritize our lives. So this combination of hope and sharper focus really does equal this greater empowerment that we've been talking about, financially, mentally, physically, and socially. And all of that really leads to people making much more choiceful decisions as it relates to how they spend their money. 62% of Americans support brands they feel do more good than harm to society. People are realizing that there are a lot of cracks in the system. The pandemic revealed many of those. And as this verbatim says on the right, people want to know that the power of their dollar is going to help make this world better in the future. So that's really the big implication that I think brands need to have in mind in the context of where they can be of use and utility as it relates to what people need as we reemerge from this pandemic. So let's go through a few examples of how we're already seeing that. The first is from a financial perspective. It's really about breaking down the walls and enabling literacy for all. And we're seeing that happening, with the GameStop scenario that happened in January. That really helped to reveal a lot of the cracks potentially on Wall Street. And we're seeing kind of this democratization of financial education come through. For example, on TikTok, FinTalk is really a dominant content source on TikTok, where people are actually able to access content that helps them learn things about empowering themselves as it relates to their finances. We're also seeing the emergence of new apps or investing opportunities that really open up what investing is to new audiences. It's not like the thing you have to have a financial advisor to do. It's becoming much more, again, empowered. So the example here is an app called Griffin, where you don't even necessarily have to make the decisions of where you're investing. That piece of it is done for you. It's really driven by where are you already shopping, where are you spending your money, and enabling investing through that. And like I said before, crypto is absolutely entering the mainstream. What does that look like? Near term versus long term, we shall see. But this example is from Chipotle, where they recently did a promotion where they were giving away Bitcoin for National Burrito Day. So it's definitely something that whether it has the legs or not, it's absolutely entering the mainstream, and many more people are jumping into that. From a mental perspective, and Chrissy alluded to this earlier, it's very much about the normalization of the importance of self-care. And we're seeing that across the board from many different brands, like in the context of the Selena Gomez example here. Her rare beauty company announced a $100 million rare impact fund for mental health services, so to make those accessible to people. And there's a lot of examples. I saw just yesterday that MTV and Viacom announced an initiative around mental health and ensuring that people have the tools they need to get through that. What that means. And then we're also seeing things like Whole Foods partnering with Headspace, doing a series of content really focused on education around the linkage of food and mental health. Again, kind of reiterating that holistic approach that people are looking at more frequently now. And then finally, just in the context of normalizing self-care, it's about prioritizing mental health days for employees. So this week, in fact, LinkedIn gave their entire company the week off to prevent burnout. And I know other companies have been doing this, just giving random mental health days to the full company to just take time for themselves, disconnect, recharge. And that's something that we're really seeing increasingly where brands can play a role. Similarly, physically, it's about empowering people to gain access to physical health and prioritize physical health and be more open about what that means. It's not just about, the traditional sense of the ideal body, like body positivity and kind of owning who you are and what that looks like for yourself, and making that a very individual thing is something that we're seeing across the board. Example here from Athleta, who's always kind of had this very driven focus on the power of she and body positivity. And we're seeing that increasingly from many brands as well. I think there's also just this realization that access is a huge issue for many of these topics. And so we're seeing more organizations that are focusing on kind of how do we create more equal access to fitness and physical health capabilities. And then finally, the importance of digital health apps. Most recently, I think just in the past week, Weight Watchers announced their new Digital 360 offer, which is really having a coach that you can access at any time. And again, I think it reiterates this holistic idea that Christy talked about, where it's not just about like the actual exercise, it's about like how you're eating and like really looking at that kind of full picture, that 360 picture of health. And then finally, socially, it's really about enabling safe and meaningful connection. And it's been really interesting to see how brands have been helping in this context. The example you see on the left here, Babe Wine and Bumble actually partnered together to do this during the pandemic, where they were helping people move during a breakup. So imagine breaking up during the pandemic and then having to figure out moving, finding a new place. That's a lot of stress. So just a really thoughtful execution here from these two brands in terms of helping in the context of that experience. And Chrissy already mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of the dating apps enable easier ways to kind of connect safely, whether it's filtering by people who've been vaccinated and things like that. Another interesting kind of way that brands are helping is just making it easier to show your vaccination status. I mentioned earlier how Instagram kind of has the sticker, the GIF that you can add to your Instagram stories, but this is an example from Staples, where they're offering free lamination of your COVID card, because, you just get this paper card. I guess you could take a picture of it, but what if we have to show it, wherever we go? Who knows what that's going to look like? So this is a helpful thing that Staples is doing for people. And then on the right here, you see that, I think this has been a consistent theme throughout the pandemic, just this connection of travel with safety, and a lot of that kind of coming through in these partnerships where, in this context, Lysol partnering with TripAdvisor and creating like these sanitization kits that people can use from a travel perspective. So I think, kind of looking at all of these examples and looking at all of the learning that we've looked at over the past year, there's a few things that keep coming through in terms of what people expect from brands. It's definitely about dependability, honesty, and ease. And I think we wanted to kind of finish up our presentation today with this quote from one of our members. We had our members kind of write a breakup letter or a love letter to a brand of their choice and really specify kind of what they did that led to that experience in their relationship. And you can see Amazon is actually one of the brands that continually has come up as kind of like helping me through this pandemic in our research. But you can see how they kind of talk about why. Because I can count on you. Because even though you've not always been perfect, you've been honest and respectful, you've been kind and solution oriented, you've brought me into a whole new world of trust and belief that shopping online will work. And I'm so grateful that you have brought jobs to my area to help people. I'm so thankful that you have managed to be a force for good during these times. So I think at the end of the day, really making sure you're human-centered in the decisions you're making as a brand, and being there to help people through this time of reemergence is key. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's any questions. Is it this? All right. Hi, Christy. So let's see if there's any questions. All right. So we had a question looking at kind of how the finding joy question that we have about how people are finding joy in spring this year compares to what we saw last spring. Do you want to talk about that, Christy? I know we've seen some differences.
Actually, I was going to say we've seen a lot of similar things. So against the theme of staying close to home. So whether that was doing a home improvement project or spending, close time with families outside in the yard, a lot of those same themes, are similar to what we saw last year in the spring.
Yeah. There's another question just looking at kind of what impact are we seeing from the stimulus check? And I think I kind of alluded to this earlier. There definitely in social conversation was a huge spike in conversation about the stimulus checks and the hope behind that. But I think there's also just the realization that it's just one small thing, and is it enough of a bridge, and kind of what does that look like more long term? I don't know if there's anything to add, Christy, in terms of what we're seeing from your perspective.
Yeah, I would say similar. I mean, it's definitely helpful for people, but isn't always enough to kind of close the gap if they're falling behind on rent or bills or things like that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know we only have 45 minutes with you all today, so we want to be respectful of your time. There were some other questions we definitely can follow up with, but thank you all for being here with us today, and good luck breaking down your pandemic wall.